9 o'clock a.m. August 22nd, 1944. Over the Italian Alps, a 7-ton American P-47 is falling out of the sky in total silence. The engine is dead. The propeller is frozen, and Captain Jack Reynolds is aiming straight at the most heavily defended tunnel in Europe, because if the enemy can't hear you, they can't kill you. The silence was wrong. Fighters were never silent, especially not a P-47 Thunderbolt. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, a 7-ton brute built around raw horsepower and noise. When its engine ran, the mountains heard it coming. When it stopped, physics said the airplane should die with it. Captain Jack Reynolds knew that. Every pilot did. A P-47 without power wasn't a glider, it was a falling anvil. No second chances. No gentle landing. Just gravity, waiting to collect. Reynolds was dropping toward the Brenner Pass at nearly 300 miles per hour, hands tight on the stick, wind screaming over the canopy. Below him lay a narrow granite throat carved through the Alps, the single supply artery keeping the German army alive in Italy. Every tank shell, every gallon of fuel, every train had to pass through that valley. And the Germans had turned it into a death trap. Flak towers guarded every bridge and tunnel. 88mm guns, quad 20s. A wall of steel American pilots called the zipper. Fly in loud, and it closed. Fly in slow, and you died. But Reynolds wasn't flying loud. He wasn't flying at all. He was falling, betting his life on one dangerous idea, that silence could do what firepower never could. Silence wasn't just unusual over the Brenner Pass, it was deadly to the Germans. Their real defense wasn't the guns, it was the ears. Hidden across the mountains were strange metal contraptions, like giant trumpets bolted together and pointed at the sky. Acoustic locators, primitive, crude, but terrifyingly effective. They could hear an American fighter engine from 10 miles away. Long before a pilot ever saw the valley, the Germans already knew he was coming. The moment that distant rumble reached the operators, phones rang. Gunners dropped cigarettes. Fingers slid onto triggers. By the time American planes arrived over the target, the sky ahead of them was already measured, bracketed, and waiting. And when the sirens wailed, German train crews reacted instantly, throttling up and diving their locomotives into tunnels carved straight into solid granite. Inside the mountain, they were untouchable. Bombs could shake the rock, but they couldn't reach steel hidden in stone. The pilots of the 57th Fighter Group knew the pattern by heart. Hundreds of miles flown, fuel burned, friends lost, and always the same ending, just in time to watch the last railcar vanish into darkness. They weren't fighting trains, they were fighting timing. They were fighting sound. Captain Jack Reynolds had had enough. He was a veteran now, old enough to recognize when the rulebook was getting people killed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, he flew, the jug was a monster. Thick-skinned, overpowered, nearly indestructible. But it screamed through the sky like a freight train. Its turbocharger howled so loud, it echoed off the canyon walls, announcing its arrival like a warning bell. That noise had become a death sentence. Night after night, Reynolds sat alone with a warm beer, staring at maps, replaying missions in his head. How do you sneak a 7-ton flying tank past an enemy that listens for a living? The answer didn't come from a briefing room or a manual. It came from the valley itself, from a hawk folding its wings and dropping out of the sky without a sound. The order came in late August, carried by a tense intelligence briefing and a map pinned flat with shaking fingers. Recon had spotted it, a ghost train, 30 cars long, packed with heavy artillery shells, rolling south toward the Gothic line. If it made it through, American infantry would pay the price in blood. The train wasn't running by day. It hid. And now it was hiding in the worst place imaginable, the Avisio Tunnel, carved straight into a vertical granite cliff, shielded by a concrete overhang. Bomb it from above, and the mountain would shrug it off. To kill the train, you had to put explosives inside the hole. And guarding that hole was the deadliest flak battery in the sector quad, 20mm guns, with a perfect view of the approach, backed by the same listening network that had slaughtered pilots for months. The colonel studied the map in silence. Low clouds, high winds. Too dangerous for a squadron, too important to ignore. Finally, he looked up at Reynolds. He didn't mention glide ratios or manuals this time. He just tapped the tunnel with his finger. "Target has to die," he said. "I don't care how. And I don't want to hear about the physics." Reynolds understood. That was permission. Hours later, ground crews loaded 2 ugly 500-pound bombs under the Jug's wings, heavy, unforgiving. Reynolds climbed into the cockpit while his wingman, Lieutenant Red Miller, taxied up alongside. Miller thought it was a routine dive bombing run. He didn't know his flight leader was about to commit the one sin aviation never forgives, killing his own engine on purpose. The prop spun into a roar that shook the airfield. As Reynolds rolled toward the runway, his eyes kept drifting back to the small red mixture lever. Life or silence. They climbed into the cold, punching through cloud toward 12,000 feet. The Alps rose ahead like broken teeth. The Brenner Pass cut through them, a narrow, lethal throat. Flak bursts bloomed high above black flowers, searching for bombers that weren't there. Down in the valley, spotters waited. Gunners listened. Reynolds keyed his mic and told Miller to stay high, to watch for fighters. He lied about fuel and engine trouble. Miller hesitated, then acknowledged. 8 miles out, Reynolds leveled off. This was the point of no return. If the engine didn't come back, there would be no crash report, just a smear of aluminum on stone. He took one breath, reached forward, and pulled the mixture to idle cutoff. The engine died with a single, violent cough. One sharp bang echoed through the airframe, and then nothing. The roar vanished so fast, it felt like someone had ripped the sound out of the sky. The nose dropped hard. Reynolds forced the stick forward, muscles straining as the P-47 stopped flying and started falling. He slammed the prop lever to course. The blades twisted. The windmilling stopped. Ahead of him, one frozen blade pointed straight up like a clock hand stuck at midnight. Silence flooded the cockpit. Not peace pressure, a thin, hissing rush of air over metal. He could hear the creak of the wings. He could hear his own breathing. Speed built fast. 280, 300. The Jug stabilized heavy and smooth, a 7-ton sled sliding downhill. Reynolds aimed straight at the valley floor and let gravity take over. Above him, the snow-capped peaks slid past. Below him, the Brenner Pass opened like a stone coffin. He was inside the canyon now. If he restarted the engine, the noise would bounce off the cliffs and wake every gunner for miles. There was no going back. Then he saw it, the Avisio Tunnel, a black mouth carved into sheer rock. And above it, just as intelligence promised, concrete flak pits embedded into the cliff. Quad 20s, barrels pointed skyward, gunners relaxed, scanning south, listening for a sound that never came. A flash caught Reynolds' eye. High on a ridge, a German spotter turned his head, catching sunlight off the canopy. A flare arced upward, single red. Aircraft sighted. Confusion rippled through the valley. The gunners hesitated, arguing, pointing. They hadn't heard anything. Maybe it was one of theirs. Maybe it was already dying. That hesitation was everything. Reynolds dropped lower, skimming just above the trees, coming in from behind the guns. The flak finally erupted, but too high. The Germans assumed a screaming dive from above. They filled the sky with steel, where the noise should have been. Reynolds slid under its shock waves, pounding his wings as shrapnel rained harmlessly overhead. 1 mile. The airspeed bled off. Controls went heavy. Too slow and he'd stall. Too fast and the bombs would overshoot. He lined up the tunnel mouth, a dark arch swallowing the tracks. He could see the train now, steel cars frozen halfway into the mountain. 200 yards. Reynolds held his breath. He pulled the release. The jug leapt upward as 1,000 pounds fell away. The bomb struck the gravel, skipped like stones, and vanished into darkness. Reynolds didn't look back. He shoved the throttle forward, hit the starter, and waited as a granite wall filled his windshield. Nothing happened. The starter whined, fighting the frozen propeller metal, screaming against the wind. Reynolds was out of time. 200 feet off the ground, 200 miles an hour. A vertical wall of granite filling the canopy like the face of death itself. This was the part the manuals talked about, the part no one survived. He rammed the mixture forward, pumped the primer, hit the starter again. Still nothing. The jug was no longer an airplane. It was a bullet with a pilot inside seconds from erasing itself against the mountain. Reynolds screamed into his oxygen mask, not in fear, but in rage. He had come too far to be beaten by cold oil and bad luck. Then one cylinder fired. A puff of black smoke burst from the exhaust. Another cylinder caught. Then 3. Then the entire engine exploded back to life with a violent chest-rattling roar. The propeller blurred. Torque slammed the aircraft sideways. Reynolds stomped the rudder and hauled the stick into his gut as the P-47 clawed upward, clearing the flak tower by feet. Helmets flew off German gunners as the jug rocketed past them alive again. Behind him, the mountain detonated. Inside the tunnel, the bombs touched off the first car of artillery shells. That explosion ignited the next, and the next. The tunnel became a cannon barrel. Fire and pressure had nowhere to go but out. A sheet of flame blasted from the mountain, shredding concrete, hurling rail cars across the valley, erasing the flak position that had guarded the pass for years. The impossible tunnel ceased to exist. High above, Reynolds' wingman stared in disbelief as the valley erupted and then watched the jug burst out of the smoke, climbing like a rocket. "Good God, Jack," he radioed, voice shaking. "You didn't just hit the tunnel. You moved the mountain." Reynolds barely heard him. His hands were still shaking. He leveled off, checked the gauges green across the board. The engine hummed warm and alive. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound he had never loved more. Back at base, the colonel waited. Empty bomb racks. One pilot standing where physics said there should be a funeral. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Did you survive the physics?" Reynolds lit a cigarette and smiled. "Physics worked fine, sir. Gravity did most of the work." I just steered. The war would never sound the same again. The story should have ended on the runway. Most war stories do. One impossible mission, one lucky pilot, a handshake, a warning, and silence. But this one didn't stop there because silence was the weapon now. Word spread fast through the 57th Fighter Group. Not rumors, details, numbers, altitudes, speeds. Reynolds wasn't telling a story, he was teaching a lesson. In mess halls and briefing tents, pilots leaned in as he sketched on napkins, explaining how a 7-ton fighter could fall like a hawk, how to trade altitude for speed, how to twist the prop to cheat the air, how long you could stay silent before gravity demanded payment. The jokes stopped. The paper airplanes disappeared. When flak got thick, when targets were buried deep, and listening for every mistake, pilots began to look at each other and tap their headsets. Climb high, cut the mixture, turn into ghosts. The Germans never understood what changed. Their sound locators still worked. The phones still rang. But sometimes nothing came. No roar, no warning. Just explosions tearing open bridges and tunnels they believed were untouchable. They blamed operators. They checked equipment. They hunted for a new American engine that didn't exist. They never guessed the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The weapon wasn't new steel. It was the off switch. Reynolds finished his tour before the odds caught up with him. 80 missions, too many close calls. The colonel sent him home while he was still alive. He left Italy quietly, without headlines or parades, traded a flight jacket for a suit, and lived the rest of his life like a man who knew exactly how fragile things were. He died in 1985. At the funeral, old pilots stood stiff and gray, swapping memories. Not about kills, not about medals. One man, his old wingman, raised a glass and spoke softly. To Jack, he said, "The only pilot I ever knew who knew when to shut up long enough to win a war." Today, people look at a P-47 and see power, guns, horsepower, noise. They don't see the frozen propeller. They don't hear the wind over the canopy. They don't know that once in the Alps, that brute became invisible. History is loud, but sometimes victory arrives without a sound. Years later, the war would be remembered for its noise, the thunder of artillery, the roar of bombers, speeches shouted over cheering crowds. History likes volume. It feels important. But Jack Reynolds' war lived in the gaps between those sounds, in the moments when engines went quiet and courage spoke without words. The P-47 Thunderbolt became a museum piece, frozen behind ropes and placards. Visitors stared at its guns and imagined violence measured in decibels. They read about horsepower and firepower and walked away thinking they understood it. They never imagined that the same machine, this blunt, brutal slab of American steel, had once slipped through a mountain valley like a ghost. Reynolds never corrected them. He didn't write a book. He didn't give interviews. When asked what it felt like to fall out of the sky in a dead airplane, he just smiled and changed the subject. How do you explain that terror can be quiet? That the most dangerous moment of your life can sound like nothing at all? The men who flew with him understood. They remembered the day the mountains exploded. They remembered learning that sometimes the bravest move wasn't to push the throttle forward, but to pull it back. To trust gravity. To trust yourself. To accept that survival didn't always come from more power, but from restraint. That was the real legacy of the Ghost Run. Not a tactic, not a trick, a mindset. The idea that war isn't just about who hits hardest, but who thinks differently when everyone else follows the noise. Somewhere in an old photograph, a P-47 dives toward a valley, its propeller blurred into nothing. Freeze that image. Imagine it stopped. Imagine the wind whistling over the canopy. Imagine the courage it took to kill the engine and let the earth rush up to meet you. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. And for one brief moment in 1944, it was the sound of victory. But silence has a way of fading if no one protects it. Stories like Reynolds don't survive on their own. They slip between footnotes drowned out by louder victories and bigger names. Battles with more explosions, machines with more guns, heroes who fit neatly into headlines. The Ghost Run didn't. It was too strange, too quiet, too human. And yet that quiet moment changed the air war over Italy. Not because it was repeated every day, but because it proved something dangerous. That the enemy's greatest strength could become his weakness. That certainty could be broken. That a system built on prediction collapses when the rules change. The Germans trusted their ears. Reynolds taught them that ears could be fooled. Long after the war, pilots who had never met Jack Reynolds still talked about him, not as a legend shouted across a bar, but as a lesson passed down carefully. Know when power helps you. Know when it kills you. The engine was a tool, not a crutch. And sometimes the bravest thing a pilot could do was to let go of the one thing that made him feel safe. This is why these stories matter. Not because they glorify war, but because they reveal choice. War strips men down to decisions made in seconds, under pressure no civilian will ever feel. Reynolds chose silence when instinct demanded noise. He chose risk when routine guaranteed failure. And because of that choice, trains burned guns, fell silent, and soldiers on the ground lived to see another sunrise. The next time you hear an engine roar in an old combat film, remember that somewhere in that same war, another engine was deliberately shut down. No cheering crowds, no music swelling, just wind gravity and a man steering 7 tons of falling metal through a narrow valley of stone. History remembers the loud moments easily. The quiet ones need someone to speak for them. This is one of those moments. And maybe that's the final irony of Jack Reynolds' story. The man who won by disappearing almost vanished himself. No monument marks the spot where the mountain burned. No plaque tells you that a 7-ton fighter once fell through this valley without a sound. The war moved on. History kept shouting. But silence leaves ripples. Every time a pilot questions the obvious solution, every time a commander chooses imagination over habit, every time someone realizes that the rules only work until someone dares to break them, that's Reynolds echoing forward in time, not as a name, but as an instinct. The Germans never solved the mystery. Their reports spoke of unexplained attacks of defenses triggered too late, of targets destroyed without warning. They searched for new aircraft, new engines, new technology. They missed the truth because it was too simple to fear the Americans hadn't gotten louder. They had learned how to be quiet. And that lesson doesn't belong to one war or one airplane. It belongs to every moment where survival depends not on strength, but on judgment. On knowing when to push and when to pull back. On understanding that sometimes the boldest move is restraint. Reynolds never asked to be remembered. He didn't need his name carved into stone. What mattered was that on one cold morning in 1944, when every instinct screamed for noise, he chose silence and made it lethal. So when this story ends, don't imagine an explosion. Imagine the wind. Imagine a frozen propeller. Imagine a pilot holding his breath as the earth rushes up, trusting physics, trusting himself, trusting that quiet can cut deeper than steel. That is how the ghost run ends, not with a roar, but with the understanding that victory doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply happens before anyone hears it coming. And that is where the story finally settles, not in the valley, not in the fire, but in what came after. When the noise faded and the war rolled on, the ghost run remained what it had always been, a reminder that courage isn't always loud. Jack Reynolds went home before the war ended, not because he failed, but because he had pushed his luck far enough. The colonel understood the math. 80 missions was already tempting fate. Physics always gets its due eventually. Better to send the man home while the engine was still running. Reynolds packed his gear, took one last look at the battered jug that had carried him through silence and fire, and left Italy without ceremony. Back in the States, there were no crowds waiting, no headlines. The war was too big, the world too busy counting tanks and generals. Reynolds became just another man in a suit. He built airplanes instead of flying them. He raised a family. He lived quietly like someone who had already used up his share of drama. When asked about the war, he kept it simple. I flew fighters. That was enough. But silence doesn't mean absence. It means restraint. And those who had been there remembered. The men of the 57th carried the lesson forward, not written in manuals, but etched into instinct. When a target felt impossible, when flak grew too thick, when noise became a liability, they remembered the frozen propeller. They remembered the off switch. Today, history books still talk about power, about engines and guns and thunder in the sky. But somewhere between the lines is a colder truth. That on one morning in 1944, victory came without sound. That a man trusted gravity more than noise. That a machine built to roar learned how to whisper. And maybe that's the final lesson of the ghost run. Not just how wars are won, but how stories should be remembered. Not for how loud they were, but for how much courage it took to be quiet. Long after the engines cooled and the uniforms were folded away, the silence Jack Reynolds trusted still lingered. It lived in the spaces between the stories we tell about war, the pauses history often skips because they're too quiet to dramatize, too subtle to celebrate. Yet those pauses are where the truth hides. The ghost run wasn't about bravery in the way movies like to show it. There was no charge, no shouted orders, no triumphant roar. It was about restraint under pressure, about knowing when not to act, about resisting the most basic instinct a pilot has to add power, to make noise, to fight gravity with force instead of understanding. Reynolds didn't overpower the battlefield. He listened to it. And then he removed himself from its expectations. That's why the story endures. Not because it can be repeated easily, it can't. Not because it fits a manual, it never did. But because it exposes something uncomfortable about war and about people. That sometimes the safest path is the one everyone tells you is insane. That sometimes survival depends on doing less not more. Reynolds' P-47 sits in museums, now frozen in time. Kids stare up at it, imagining the thunder it once made. They don't imagine the moment when that thunder stopped. When a pilot chose to trust empty air and falling speed. When the most powerful thing in the sky became invisible. And that's why this story matters. Because history doesn't just belong to the loud. It belongs to the thinkers, the risk-takers, the ones who step outside the pattern and accept the cost. Reynolds never asked for recognition. He understood something deeper, that the real victory wasn't destroying a tunnel or a train. It was proving that certainty can be broken. The Ghost Run didn't change the war overnight, but it changed how men thought. And sometimes that's enough to tilt the balance. Silence didn't make Jack Reynolds weak. It made him unstoppable. In the end, the Ghost Run wasn't a tactic you could mass produce. It was too dangerous, too dependent on judgment, timing, and nerve. You couldn't order it into existence. You had to choose it. And that choice, made alone in a cockpit with gravity waiting, was the real story. Jack Reynolds understood that better than anyone. He never claimed he'd outsmarted the war. He knew he'd simply slipped through a crack it hadn't noticed yet. Wars adapt. Enemies learn. Sooner or later, silence would be answered with new defenses. But for one critical window, when American lives hung in the balance, silence tipped the scale. And that was enough. What Reynolds proved wasn't just how to defeat flak or fool sound locators. He proved that war punishes predictability, that systems built on certainty collapse when confronted with imagination. The Germans prepared for noise. They prepared for speed. They prepared for fear expressed loudly. They were not prepared for a man who trusted physics more than procedure, and who accepted that control sometimes comes from surrendering power. That lesson reaches far beyond the Alps of 1944. It lives wherever people face impossible odds and are told this is how it's always been done. It lives in every moment where courage doesn't look like force, but like restraint. Where survival depends not on pressing harder, but on letting go. The Ghost Run reminds us that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it slips past defenses unnoticed. Sometimes it arrives already falling, already committed, with no applause waiting at the bottom. History will always remember the roar of engines. But buried beneath that noise is another truth, one harder to hear and easier to forget. That on a cold morning in 1944, victory rode on silence judgment and a man willing to trust the empty air. And that is where this story truly ends. Not with fire, not with thunder, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly when to turn the noise off and never looked back. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of the Ghost Run, how easily it could have been lost forever. One frozen propeller, one silent dive, one decision made in seconds. If the engine hadn't caught, this wouldn't be a story. It would be a footnote, or nothing at all. That's how close history often comes to erasing its most human moments. We remember outcomes, not risks. We remember victories, not the fragile chain of choices that made them possible. Jack Reynolds didn't win because he was invincible. He won because he accepted vulnerability and acted anyway. In the cockpit, there was no guarantee, no backup plan, no applause waiting, just a man, a machine, and gravity doing exactly what gravity always does. The courage wasn't in diving. Anyone can fall. The courage was in not turning back when every instinct demanded noise, power, and control. That's why the ghost run still matters. Not as a legend to admire from a distance, but as a reminder of how thin the line really is between failure and transformation. One pilot questioning a rule. One moment of restraint in a world built on excess. One quiet act that changed how an entire enemy system worked. The war moved on. New tactics replaced old ones. Jets would soon scream across the sky, faster and louder than anything Reynolds ever flew. But none of that erased what happened in that valley. Because progress doesn't only come from more power. Sometimes it comes from subtraction. So when you think about bravery, don't picture noise. Picture silence held under pressure. Picture a hand hovering over a switch, knowing exactly what it costs to pull it back. Picture a man willing to fall because he understood that falling at the right moment could change everything. That is the final echo of the ghost run. Not a roar that fades with time, but a quiet truth that endures. And if there is a final image to hold on to, it isn't the explosion or the fireball tearing out of the mountain. It's quieter than that. It's Jack Reynolds sitting on the wing of his P-47 after landing flight suit soaked with sweat, hands still trembling as the engine ticks and pings while it cools. No cheering, no music, just the sound of metal settling after being pushed past its limits. War rarely gives you time to process what you've survived. The next mission always waits. But for a moment, Reynolds understood how close he had come to never climbing out of that cockpit. He had trusted gravity, trusted physics, trusted himself, and for once, it had all held together. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. That's the truth. Most war stories smooth over. Victory isn't clean. It isn't certain. It balances on choices made when there's no good option left, only the least impossible one. Reynolds didn't beat the enemy by overpowering him. He beat him by refusing to play the game as written. And that's why the ghost run still speaks even decades later. Not to pilots alone, but to anyone who's ever faced a problem where brute force failed, where noise made things worse, where the only way forward was counterintuitive, uncomfortable, and terrifyingly quiet. The world rewards confidence. War rewards aggression. But every so often history turns on a different axis. On restraint, on patience, on a single human being willing to pull back instead of push forward. Jack Reynolds never tried to be a symbol. He never chased legacy. He simply did what the moment demanded, then went home and lived his life. And maybe that's the most American part of the story. The idea that extraordinary courage doesn't require extraordinary people, just ordinary ones placed under unbearable pressure who choose wisely. The ghost run doesn't end with applause. It ends with understanding. That sometimes the bravest sound a hero can make is none at all. And that understanding is what finally closes the circle, not the mission report, not the grainy gun camera film, but the quiet realization that war at its core is a test of judgment more than strength. Jack Reynolds passed that test not by overpowering the moment, but by reading it correctly. The ghost run didn't rewrite doctrine. It didn't turn every fighter into a glider or silence the skies overnight. What it did was far more dangerous. It proved that the enemy's certainty could be broken, that defenses built on habit and expectation could be slipped past by a single human decision. Once that door opened, it never fully closed again. Long after Reynolds was gone, the lesson remained. In every cockpit, in every command tent, in every moment, when someone hesitated before following the manual, his shadow was there. A reminder that rules are written for averages and wars are decided by outliers, by people willing to accept risk when the alternative is guaranteed failure. This is why his story deserves to be remembered. Not because it was loud or flashy, but because it was honest. It showed what courage actually looks like when stripped of romance. Sweaty hands, shaking knees. A choice made with no promise of survival. The ghost run wasn't about cheating death. It was about facing it clearly and choosing anyway. So when this story fades to black, don't imagine a final explosion or a swelling anthem. Imagine instead a frozen propeller cutting through cold air, a pilot holding his breath, a valley waiting below, and understand that sometimes history doesn't turn on firepower or noise, but on the rare human courage to be quiet at exactly the right moment.